So, Adrian, and thank you very much again for doing this. And I would pass it to you for introduction and your presentation.
Right, thank you very much, Hossein, and thanks for welcoming me to this presentation. As I say, as we discussed the other day, just to contextualise, my route into education was slightly different to perhaps the audience that we're intending to reach out to here, as in my PhD was very much embedded in a discipline, and I went into educational development much later on. So I've entitled this presentation "From Richard Rorty to Dilly Fung and Back Again?" Because I may have kind of gone first for full circle with this. My journey from PhD to educational development. So I'm currently an associate professor in educational development here in OCADE, the Oxford Centre for Academic Advancement and Development, which entails me essentially doing a lot of work with faculty, particularly in relation to assessment. And we also do a taught scheme leading to fellowship of advanced HE and obviously senior fellowship as well. So that's centrally my role. But I started off with an interest very much in late 18th century literature, particularly political and religious propaganda, and also philosophy as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about the PhD and why I did a PhD and kind of what underpinned my PhD really. So why do a PhD? I think it all stems from the fact that I'm dyslexic. Um, I was repeatedly told at school that I would never amount to anything and that one day I might make someone a good husband, and that was about it. My parents just had to accept that I was of below average intelligence, and I thought that was sort of rooted in me from the age 7, I would say. Um, so there were two reasons that I wanted to do a PhD. One was that I had a genuine passion for 18th century literature that stemmed from my undergraduate work and my master's work. But also, I wanted to prove a point. I wanted to prove that someone with dyslexia could, in fact, do a PhD in English, which is obviously inherently difficult given that English is the main difficulty that individuals with dyslexia have. So I wanted to prove that point, but I was particularly interested in dialogue. I was interested in dialogue primarily because I'd witnessed two things. One was how dialogue could be used as a form of manipulation, um, not only to manipulate myself, coming from, for example, teachers and parents and things like that. I wanted to really dig into and understand how it worked, how people could become manipulated psychologically through dialogue. But also, I saw, and this is the kind of the liberal in me, the potential of dialogue as a kind of form of emancipation and as a key form of education, actually, as well. So I went into the PhD thinking that I would research all these wonderful, quite radical texts, because obviously the period that I was looking at was the Enlightenment, particularly post-Enlightenment British reactions to the Enlightenment. You had the French Revolution going on. There was a sense in Britain, certainly on the left, as we conceive of it now, of the potential for overthrowing the monarchy, like the French had done, and actually becoming a more free and liberal society. And a lot of kind of liberal or radical, as they were called at the time, philosophers and thinkers were using dialogue as a way of exploring some of these ideas, as a way of kind of like emancipating people. So I was really excited about this. But then when I hit the Bodleian Library and started really researching this, I found that actually the overwhelming number of literary dialogue. So when I say a literary dialogue, it is a textual form of dialogue. So it's not a play, it's not a novel, obviously, it's not poetry either. It's a particular form of dialogue that's been chronically under researched for many, many years. Um, and if you think of Plato's dialogues, we're thinking 18th century versions of that. Now, if anyone's read Plato, a lot of the dialogues, well, actually, they're quite inconclusive in the sense that they never really arrive at any particular truth. It's about the process of actually philosophizing. Hopefully I'm saying that right. What I found to my dismay in the late 18th century is that actually dialogue was used primarily as a vehicle for propaganda, and in two key areas, mainly as a way of trying to stop a revolution, essentially in the UK. So it was political and religious propaganda. So the political propaganda, it very often depicted in a literary form a fairly sort of wise person talking to some fairly uneducated individual about the errors of their ways and the fact that they shouldn't read Tom Paine's Rights of Man or Mary Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women, all that sort of thing. And actually, they should embrace the church and state and just go home and feed their families and keep their heads down, essentially. That was quite disappointing. And then the religious propaganda, particularly kind of like on the evangelical side, was about conversions. Hence why I've got conversions on there on the slide. So it's effectively about taking individuals who were questioning God, questioning the power of the state, questioning the government, and converting them to loyal subjects, essentially. And that's what the literature was primarily about. So, to my disappointment, I realised that actually this isn't about emancipation. Dialogue is about coercion. So I looked into kind of like the philosophy of this and at a linguistic level how it was actually operating, and that was kind of like the basis of my PhD. And obviously, fundamentally, a lot of it is grounded in pedagogy and education, that the way in which you can kind of not manipulate people. Well, it was being used for manipulating people, but the way in which you can actually get through to people through dialogue to teach them something. So it was essentially a mentoring scenario. So mentoring was key to this, and this kind of set the seed, really, I guess, for the rest of my career in education. But obviously, the focus back then was on the literature and the philosophy. Um, so it was all about coercion. It was all about didacticism. It was all about creating loyal subjects. But then, as reading audiences actually began to expand towards the end of the 18th century, people actually started to see through this. This is one of my arguments in my thesis. And the dialogue genre essentially collapsed into satire. So in the 1820s and 1830s, um, the dialogue genre was no longer used for propaganda purposes, either religious or political, and actually it was much more used for humour. So we had all sorts of dialogues, like dialogues by Thomas Love Peacock, where you got kind of fake characters that were actually orangutans in Parliament, and they become these really attractive characters that everyone wants to marry. A lot about sort of dodgy marriages and sort of just humour, essentially. And then also dialogues of the dead, imaginary conversations. So you'd have various kind of characters from history or philosophy sat in the everlasting flames of hell arguing about who was in the hottest flames, and it was just kind of humour essentially. And then the dialogue genre essentially died. It collapsed. I mean, the Victorian period, obviously, they started, I don't know whether it was something in the water, they started producing these kind of 800-page novels and things like that. And obviously, poetry was still very much a predominant genre. The dialogue genre actually, in effect, died. So yeah, so my grounding in education came from that. I converted the PhD into a book which came out in 2011. So just for a bit of context, my PhD lasted from 2002 to 2008. I did it part time. I did the first year full time, and the rest of it was part time, and combined it with work in order to kind of fund it. And then I worked for the University of Warwick as a sessional lecturer there for many years before going to Royal Holloway. And during that time, I wrote the monograph. So yeah, that was kind of that, and I was essentially quite happy at the University of Warwick teaching Romantic and Victorian period poetry predominantly. So then I was asked essentially to do a PG cert in higher education, and that marked the kind of the period in which I shifted towards education more in a more focused way. So the PG cert in education, there were two revelations really. One was the fact that um, I was teaching very able students. These were grade A students. I was quite happily sat there talking about Keats, Byron, Blake, and the French Revolution. Great, happy days. But there was something missing. There was something really missing for me. And I was loving the literature, but I seemed to lack a purpose. There was something that there was just couldn't quite put my finger on it until I realised that actually I had very, very able students who in the class could articulate themselves really well. But when it came to their essays, they were actually not really living up to their potential. And I was marking their essays essentially, based on the marking criteria on their understanding of the topic. There was not a real sense that I could kind of move them to the next level. Now, this was a situation that I was in the second year of my undergraduate degree. I was quite happily sort of bumbling along at a kind of a 2-2 level, little bit frustrated. And back in those days, so here at Oxford Brookes, for example, we have the Centre for Academic Development, we have academic skills centres. Back then, there was nothing of that sort. It took just one lecturer who'd literally just finished her PhD. She was very young, very enthusiastic. She just took me to one side, and for 15 minutes, she sat me down and talked me through how to write a good essay. And that's when my marks suddenly catapulted from kind of a third 2-2 to a first, and the rest is history. And I thought, I've not really got that capacity to do that at the University of Warwick in my role as it was constituted. So I was a little bit concerned about that. And then I started thinking back to how I'd actually made a kind of a decent success of myself. And I realised that there was a pedagogy that I'd encountered at school, which could actually help people at university. So again, just going back to school here, as a dyslexic kid, I'd been written off by the state education. I was very fortunate to go to a school called Maple Hayes School and Research Centre in Lichfield, and they pioneered a particular visual pedagogical approach, a morphological approach to the teaching of spelling. So their primary concern was spelling. And the gist of it is that instead of using phonics, they would use visual symbols to actually break down the components of words in order to teach how to spell. So, for example, I'm going to take the word conduction. So if you say it, as you would normally say it, it would be C-O-N, con, duck, as in the duck, D-U-C-K, that's how it sounds, and then shun, S-H-U-N. That's how you would say it. But obviously that's not at all how it was spelt. So what this research centre did was broke down the components of the words into visual symbols. So pon is imagined as two arrows coming together. So that's kind of the coming together bit. Duct is a circle and a line to indicate a dog's lead, in other words, being guided. And the ION, separated from the T note, where it's very often spelt, the ION is depicted as thought bubbles. So the idea of it is the images actually connote what that component of the word actually means. And then you put it together in a visual form. And that's how I was taught to spell at this school. And I thought to myself, so I had a particular interest in obviously dyslexia, being dyslexic myself, and later just neurodiversity more generally. I thought, I wonder if you could take these principles and apply them beyond the spelling of individual words into sentences, paragraphs, and indeed whole essays. So that was basically this idea, this whole idea of that a picture is worth 1,000 words. The literature clearly shows, and this is the research that I've been involved with since, that individuals with dyslexia in particular learn best through kind of visual strategies. Einstein, who knows whether he was dyslexic or not, but the suggestion is that he was. He very often said he thought in pictures. As soon as you incorporate language into thought, he started having problems. He thought very much in visual images. So that was the basis of my PG Cert education. So here at Brooks, we do a scholarly inquiry, a desk-based scholarly inquiry, which is basically, I think it's 2,000 words. The individual just basically does some research into a pedagogical conundrum that they're encountering in the classroom. They write it up and it's part of their kind of fellowship claim. Similar thing with the PG Cert, but a little bit longer. And I investigated precisely this, the potential of using visual pedagogies as a means of helping, well, not just dyslexic students, to be fair, all students understand the basics of how to write a good essay and get their thoughts down on paper in a structured, coherent manner. And ultimately, kind of, hopefully that would help all students. So that was the beginnings, really, of my trajectory into kind of more educational development work. But wasn't quite so simple as that. So this is an image actually from the second edition. So there's two editions now of this book. So basically what I did was designed from scratch a visual system that taught grammar. I literally took it from the level of grammar and sentence construction through to how you incorporate evidence within paragraphs and analysis and evaluation, rhetorical moves within academic writing, right the way through to the full piece and across the full spectrum of all the academic genres that you're likely to encounter within academia. So academic writing, obviously, the general essay, right through to presentations. But I also developed a visual strategy for helping reading skills as well. And it was specifically geared towards dyslexic students at that point. It has evolved further to incorporate the full kind of neurodiverse paradigm subsequently, but I was mainly focused on dyslexic students. And the key to it was the key underlying principle behind it was that as educational assistive technologies, as it was known then, so this is pre-AI, I felt were actually just providing a workaround. They weren't actually kind of fundamentally solving the problem. What I wanted to do was to help create students who were autonomous learners, who could use these visual strategies, as I had done in relation to spelling, in order to excel on their own without having to put in increasing levels of sophisticated assistive technologies. So that was one principle behind it. So I wrote the book and the second book, presented at conferences and all the rest of it. And I faced two things. One was a lot of students and academics writing to me and saying, this works. It's really great. It's really transformed my life. It's really helped me to succeed. So I've got loads and loads of testimonials as to how successful this has been. But then I also faced a barrage of criticism from academics who basically said a couple of things. One was, it works. We can see it working with students, but we don't know how it works. We don't know why it works. Can you explain that to us? And the other one was, how dare you write a student textbook advocating a technology without the evidence base? So I did things the wrong way round, effectively. So I had in my mind the theory. I put it into a pedagogical approach for students. It worked, but people were a little bit sort of like, well, why can you do, you shouldn't be doing this. Essentially, where's your evidence? You need your evidence before you actually put something out into the world. So yeah, I did it the wrong way round. I make no apologies for that. My priority was to help students, actually, and it coincided with the fact that at that time I had moved from my role as a lecturer in English literature to a learning developer and a lecturer in academic writing. So this came about for two reasons. One was lack of work, essentially. but also two, going back to that point I was making earlier about how I was dissatisfied. There was something missing from my teaching of English literature. I really wanted to help people. So my role in learning development was actually really helping students on a one-to-one basis and seeing and facilitating that transformation that I'd had in the 15 minutes that I'd had with the lecturer in the second year of my undergraduate work. So I was doing that on a one-to-one basis in a group setting every single day, day in, day out. That was my bread and butter. My main focus at that point was helping students, and it was working, and I was getting a great deal of job satisfaction from it. So in some respects, yeah, I had it in my head always that there needed to be a scientific pedagogical rationale behind this. I had it in my head, but it wasn't out there in the real world. What was out there in the real world was actually the textbook for the students, which was working. So I thought at some point I'm going to have to address this issue. It was delayed somewhat because the book was a little bit too successful, and Routledge said, "Can we have a second edition?" So I did a second edition, and I still hadn't managed to get the scientific rationale out there. So that came later. In fact, it only came in November last year. So more revelations from academic writing to educational development. So I was quite happy in my role in learning development, but one thing that kept coming up again and again and again every single day was I saw students struggling in their work, and very often I was helping students to decode what it was the lecturers actually wanted. So that could be at two levels. It was either what the lecturers actually wanted in terms of their assignment briefs. So what is it the lecturers actually wanted? How do you interpret it, the marking scheme? It just wasn't clear at all, and the students were coming very, very confused. And the second was actually dealing with the feedback from the lecturers. So the students would get feedback on their assignments from the lecturers, but they couldn't interpret it. They didn't know how to interpret it. They didn't know how to action it. So as much as I was really enjoying working with the students, one of the things that I realised was that actually there's work to do here higher up the food chain in many respects with the lecturers themselves. Maybe if I can have an influence in terms of actually the academic practice of lecturers, that will feed through down the chain into greater successes for the students, making a difference, but a bit more indirectly. So that was my kind of change in my mind from learning development into educational development. So at that point, I moved from Royal Holloway, where I'd been a learning developer and a lecturer in academic writing for quite a number of years. I moved to Oxford Brookes into my current role in educational development, and that's kind of where, and obviously part of that is everything really was grounded in assessment primarily, and that's primarily my role here at Oxford Brookes, looking at assessment, but also the pedagogies had come right the way back really from school stroke the PhD. So the pedagogical kind of mentoring, supporting people, transforming people, very much in the line advocated by the likes of Dilly Fung or Martha Nussbaum, people like that. That was always there, but the focus was somewhere else. The focus was literature. It was underpinning my analysis of the literature, but the pedagogy was always there. So that's how I came into this kind of field. And that brings me to the final point here, AI and despondency or not. So AI is really interesting for me because on the one hand, it singularly undermines everything that I've tried to articulate throughout my research, in the sense that I wanted to create autonomous learners via a pedagogical strategy, whereas now, as we know, students can write their essays just using ChatGPT. They're probably not supposed to, but that's kind of the reality of what we're seeing. So that's kind of a bit depressing for me at a personal level, but it's also depressing for me in a sense because I have come from that background of being told that I would never amount to anything. I would never be a success at anything. I might day might make a good husband, but that's about it. That's what the teachers were constantly telling me. I was below average intelligence. I should just accept it. I worked my socks off every single day to be able to write in the way that I write. So, for example, my undergraduate dissertation, um, I wrote, I think it was 10,000 word undergraduate dissertation on Keats, Keats and the imagination. And I wrote, obviously, I had at my disposal a computer, but I wrote my dissertation twice on a typewriter. And the reason that I did that was because I wanted to become an English teacher. At that time, I wanted to become an English teacher. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to comfortably stand up in front of a class and a student say to me, "How do you spell facilitate?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'm dyslexic. I'm going to look at my spell checker or whatever." I didn't want to be like that person. So for my 10,000 word undergraduate degree, every word that I couldn't spell, I looked up in a dictionary on the side. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with the old typewriters, the electronic typewriters. I had a ribbon in it that would delete things, so it could delete things on the page. The problem with it was that if you misspelt a word, you could go back and delete those letters. But as soon as you'd moved on to the next word, it could no longer do that. Okay. So if there was a spelling mistake halfway down a page or towards the bottom of the page, that page would have to be put in the bin and you'd have to write the whole page again. Or you could Tipp-Ex it and kind of write over it, but it looked absolutely horrendous. So the 10,000 word draft was done like that, submitted to my supervisor, obviously lots and lots of feedback, and then the final draft was done in exactly the same way. And that's kind of how alongside the visual pedagogies I'd learned at the school, that's how I learned to write. And I still do it to a certain extent today. If I've got time, I always look up a word in the dictionary because I don't want to kind of fall back on that. I fought tooth and nail to overcome my dyslexia, whereas now people can just get AI to write whatever they want within seconds. And that's kind of a bit disheartening for me because I'm thinking, well, I've put so much work into this, and now it's kind of what's it all been for? So there's a little bit of despondency there, but there's also another element to this which really interests me because obviously utilizing AI, we're actually engaging in a dialogue with AI. We're actually mentoring AI, or is AI mentoring us? But being as we're putting the prompts into AI, we're kind of mentoring and coaching ourselves, which could be quite liberating in a way. So it all come together in the end, in that my interests kind of come together in relation to AI as well as inclusive pedagogies generally. So just finally to finish off, so the book this came out in November last year, but it is essentially 100,000 word version of the PG Cert desk inquiry that I did back in, it would be 2012. I think it was about 2012. So it's taken that long to actually kind of get it out into the world. So I've now got the student textbook, which, helps the students, and hopefully the academic rationale behind it, which satisfies what academia wants and what academic tutors wants. So basically, this book situates everything within a theory of complementary cognition, which is a cutting edge theory that I've worked alongside other academics on, which thinks of the neurodiversity paradigm in terms of search specializations, cognitive search specializations. So it's not a deficit model at all. It's very much looking at the strengths of individuals with neurodiversity. I felt that my approach needed a name, so I called it compositional pictography. So this is basically composing of academic writing, composing of language via pictures, essentially. It contains the evidence base because I've done the research and it's been proven that it's worked. So the book contains the research base as well. And I await judgment. I don't know what's going to happen next because it literally only came out in November. I think it's selling well. I've not had any review. Oh well, there's plenty of reviews that I sought, but it's not I've not seen any other reviews as yet. I guess it's early days, so I wait my judgment on how successful that book is going to be. But hopefully, it will make something of a splash. Hopefully, anyway. Um, so yeah, that was my journey essentially from PhD. Nothing really ostensibly related to education and education research, but the DNA was in it throughout. That I only kind of realised a little bit later that interest was sown back in 2002, 2003 when I started the PhD, and comes through right to the present day. And that's, I think that's it.
That's great, Adrian. Thank you very much for amazing presentation and taking us through this journey. So I would stop the recording and